Hello and welcome to the NPTEL MOOCs course on Foundation for Virtual and Augmented Reality Systems. We are going to start a new new topic on this system implementation overall broad topic. So, we will be continuing with the system implementation broadly. However, we are going to talk about something different in this part of the lecture. So, earlier we learned about the remaining two stages in the earlier parts of this lecture of this design, prototype, evaluate cycle. More specifically, we talked about the prototyping idea and the evaluation, quick evaluation of prototypes, those ideas. Also, we discussed how we implemented the Majuli VR tour in brief. Now, in this lecture, we are going to talk about another important stage for any interactive system development, that is empirical evaluation. Just to put the matters into perspective, let us quickly recollect the overall interactive system development life cycle. We have the feasibility study stage, then requirement gathering, analysis and specification stage. This one we discussed earlier. Then we talked about the design, prototype, evaluate cycle, where we primarily focus on interface and interaction design. So, the design stage we talked earlier, the evaluation and prototype and evaluation, these two stages we talked in the previous parts of this lecture. As I mentioned before, we are not going to talk about these three stages, namely code design, coding and code testing. These are any standard, these follow the standard methodologies that are already there for any system development. Our remaining interest is in empirical study, which essentially deals with evaluating usability of the developed system with end users. After code testing stage, we get a system that is executable. However, it does not say anything about usable system, whereas through empirical study or empirical evaluation, we are going to ascertain whether the system is usable or not, and this stage is going to be discussed in this part of the lecture. So, the stage is known in several forms: empirical study or usability study or empirical research and so on. So, we will be using this term empirical study. Now, previously we talked about how to evaluate usability of our designs, whatever designs we have come up with. Now, if you can recollect, those evaluations, that is the quick prototype evaluations, are primarily done by experts. Now, here the term experts essentially refer to those expert designers who are well accustomed to the domain of the problem. Of course, we have also talked about user evaluation in a very brief sense, but that was not a very rigorous or robust type of evaluation. So, everything that we talked about are in a very limited scale, be it expert evaluation or user evaluation. That limited scale, of course, is good enough for quickly identifying some major usability issues that may be there with our design. Now, the idea of design, prototype, evaluate life cycle is to have a quick design, get a quick prototype and get a quick evaluation of the prototype, so that we identify the issues, then we rectify the design, again rectify the prototype, perform another quick evaluation and so on till the number of problems reduces. Now, in order to make it quick, make everything quick, what we do is basically employ limited number of evaluators and do the evaluation only on prototypes. This is of course good for early evaluation. However, it cannot give us a conclusive result about the overall usability of the end system. For that, we need to evaluate our whole system, implemented system, with larger number of users preferably, to get a conclusive idea on usability. Now, in order to get that conclusive idea on usability, what we need is a fully implemented system. It cannot be done on prototypes. Second thing is, in order to do that, what we generally need to do is perform a controlled experiment to collect user behavioral data and also to analyze that data to come to a conclusion. So, two things are important. One is fully implemented system, and second is controlled experiment. So, these two we must have access to, or we must execute to be able to perform or to be able to conclude about the usability of the overall system. Now, when we talk of such controlled experiment, generally that is referred to as empirical research or empirical study or user study. However, in our context, it is specifically related to usability evaluation. So, we can also use that setup or that process and call it usability study. Now, when we perform this controlled experiment to collect data, analyze data to come to a conclusion, there are broadly 4 stages in that overall process of empirical research or empirical study. So, what are those 4 stages? First is identification of research questions. Now, the term here is research questions. So, essentially we are dealing with a process called empirical research. And in order to perform the research, we need to first start with some questions for which we seek the answers. Those questions, formulation of those questions or identification of those questions is the first stage of the whole process. Second thing is determination of variables. This is another important thing. Once the questions are formulated, we need to identify the variables. There are several types of variables. Unless we do that, we will not be able to design and execute a controlled experiment. So, identification of variables or determination of variables is the second stage of the process. Third is design of experiment. This is the most important part. Of course, the other two are also important, but this one is the crux of the process where we design an experiment to collect the data. So, design of experiment essentially means design of the experiment as well as collection of data by execution of the experimental design. And finally, in the fourth stage is analysis of the data. This is also a rigorous process. To come to a definite conclusion about the overall usability aspects of the system, we need to properly, scientifically, objectively analyze the data so that the conclusion is reliable, and that is also very important. So, identification of research questions is the first stage, determination of variables based on the research questions is the second stage, third is design and execution of the experiment, and finally analysis of the data to come to a conclusion. In order to understand this process or these stages, let us proceed with an example. To keep things simpler, we have chosen a simple GUI type example, so that it is easier to comprehend the idea. Suppose we have developed a new text entry interface, that is an interface through which a user can provide text input or create textual documents. So, this is nothing but a graphical user interface to provide or input text to the system. Now, what we want is, the system is developed, we have implemented the system. Now, what we want is to perform an empirical study through which we will be collecting empirical data to measure the usability of the interface. So, here it may be noted that the system has been fully implemented, and now our objective is to set up the experiment, execute the experiment, collect data for analysis, and that process is empirical study. So, with respect to this example, let us try to understand stage 1, that is research questions. What is a research question, how to formulate it, what is a good question, what is a bad question, this type of concepts let us try to understand with respect to this example. So, we want to conduct an experiment. For that, we need to frame a question. Through the experiment, we will try to answer, try to find the answer to this question. So, let us start with a question: is the new technique good, or is the new interface good? So, this is, let us term it as research question 1 or RQ1. So, if we frame such a question, what will happen? Now, based on these questions, we collect data and analyze data to answer this question. So, observations or empirical data collection needs to be performed based on this question. So, in order to do that, what we do? We present the interface to a user and ask the user to judge its quality. And we repeat this process few times for several users, say 5 users. Of course, later on we will see what is a good number of users to engage in an empirical study for suitable conclusion. So, we repeat the process few times and complete our experiment. So, what kind of observations we can make? So, this is suppose the experimental log or the recorded observations based on the research questions that we have formulated. So, there are 5 users. User 1 said good. So, our question was, is the interface good? So, user 1 said good, user 2 said poor, user 3 said not very good, but not very bad either, user 4 said good, and user 5 said very bad. Now, if we get such responses from the users, what can we conclude, and whether that conclusion is definitive? As we can observe from the logged observations, opinion is equally divided. 2 said good, 2 said poor or very bad, and 1 in between, neither good nor bad. So, it is quite possible that this type of observations we can end up with if we frame such a question and ask users for their feedback. So, from these type of observations or from these feedback, we are not likely to get answers to RQ1, is it good? We cannot conclude. So, there is something problematic with our research question. So, let us try to change it and have another question. Let us call it RQ2. Is our text input interface better than the text input interface provided by, say, MS Word. This is another experiment log. Again 5 users. User 1 says no, MS Word has many features. User 2 says yes, it is a clean interface. User 3 says difficult to say. User 4 says yes, minimal useful feature set, easy to remember. User 5 says no, can do, it should be read as do, can do many things with MS Word. Here we ask the users to compare the proposed system with another existing system, and then users revealed more. However, is it any better, these observations any better to take us to a definitive conclusion about the quality of the system, of the proposed system? So, from these observations we can conclude the following. When asked to compare, users give somewhat more concrete feedback as compared to feedback based on a standalone system. Now, better to some means more features and to others means less features. That is very interesting to observe. Some may still be confused, say user 3. So, that still also does not take us any closer to a definitive conclusion about the proposed system. Now, let us reframe the question with RQ3, research question 3. Does the new interface let me enter text faster than MS Word? This is a completely different type of formulation, as you can note by comparing it with RQ1 and RQ2, the previous two formulation of the research questions. Now, in this case what changes? We do not just ask for feedback, which may be vague and subject to interpretation, as we have just seen. Now, what we are asking for, what we are trying to collect is, we give them some task, that is input a text and ask for their feedback, which is less prone to subjective interpretation. So, now let us see what kind of feedback we can expect from the users. So, here unlike the previous cases, users could give more unambiguous answer, such as user 1 yes, user 2 yes, user 3 no, user 4 yes, user 5 yes. This is so because the question is much more unambiguous. User has to compare the two and then tell whether one is faster over the other in comparison to the other. However, although there is more clarity on the feedback, but the feedback itself may still be problematic. It may still be difficult to come to a definite conclusion. As you can see, 2 may say yes, 2 may say no, and so on and so forth. So, it is always a problem when we depend on subjective feedback. The good part here is that because of the nature of the research question, we can actually collect objective data such as text entry speed, rather than relying on subjective feedback to come to a definite conclusion. In order to collect objective data, what we need to do is, we need to set up an experiment, collect the actual text entry speeds and then compare to come to a conclusion. So, there subjective feedback is not required. We can give them the same task, that is the same text to input, then record text entry speed, number of characters entered per minute or CPM. We can compare CPM values, can give objective conclusions, that is rather than relying on subjective feedback on the idea of faster. Of course, we can collect feedback from them whether one is faster than others based on their understanding of the speed, but that is not necessarily the case. We can also collect objective measures by following this process, that we can give them some task, same task to all, record text entry speed through some logging mechanism and compare the speeds to determine which one is faster. Now, since here we are not relying only on user feedback, instead we can actually come to a conclusion based on something that is objective, not subjective to users interpretation. The R3, question number R3, we can call testable question, or sometimes it is called a hypothesis, and R1 also R2, R1 R2 as non-testable. So, in case of R1 or R2 we cannot have objective measures, it is purely based on users interpretation, subjective interpretation and their feedback, whereas for R3 we can actually collect objective information such as text entry speed irrespective of what user thinks about the speed or what user's interpretation is about the term faster. So, such type of questions if we frame, those are called testable questions. We can test them objectively, they are often called hypothesis. Other questions where we cannot directly test them objectively, they are called non-testable questions. Now, there are, so when we are given the task of framing research questions, it may happen that we have come up with testable questions, or it may so happen that we have come up with non-testable questions. So, which one is good, which one is bad, which one we should follow, these are issues that we need to resolve. Now, there is always a trade-off. We cannot frame questions based on generalized concept. For example, RQ1, whether something is good, that is a very generic concept. What is good? It is not clear, it is ambiguous. So, generally we cannot frame questions, or we should not frame questions based on generalized concept, because that may lead to untestable questions. So, when we are framing untestable questions, then the result, the feedback that we get from users are very much prone to subjective interpretation, and then from there drawing a definitive conclusion which is scientific and reliable is not possible generally. Instead, we should go for testable questions from which we can draw reliable, definite conclusion. However, if we go for more specific questions such as RQ3, we might get testable questions, but we may not get true answers. So, RQ3 says that one interface is faster than another. However, it does not say then whether something is better than another. Now, faster and better are different concepts. So, they are certainly not the same. So, we may frame testable questions, but we may not get generalized answer with such testable questions. So, to balance the trade-off, what we need to do is, we need to frame multiple testable questions, and from the conclusion of each of those questions, we can sum up the conclusion and come to a conclusion of the generalized or untestable question. Say RQ4, is the error rate within 1 hour of use less in our interface as compared to MS Word? RQ5, does the number of features supported in our interface sufficient to perform common tasks? For this, we need to collect feedback on a rating scale of 1 to 5, where 1 indicates not at all and 5 indicates totally agree. Even RQ6, can you remember the features easily on a rating scale 1 to 5, where 1 indicates not at all and 5 indicates totally agree? See, RQ 3, 4, 5, 6 or research questions 3, 4, 5, 6, these 4 we can collect objective data, because we are either using rating scale or some metric to directly measure the values, say text entry rate or error rate. Using these, we can collect objective data, we can conclude about the question, and when we combine the answer to all these questions, then we can come to a definite conclusion about the overall goodness of the interface, that is the generalized version of the question which is untestable. So, to balance the trade off, what we need to do is frame multiple research questions covering different multiple testable research questions covering different aspects of the system, so that from their conclusion we can draw conclusion about the broader untestable research questions. So, that is the stage 1 of empirical study, framing of research question. The idea is that frame research questions, multiple research questions that are testable, and from their conclusion draw definitive conclusion about untestable, broader, generalized research questions. Now, when we use the term testable, that means we can conduct study and collect objective data for conclusion, for drawing conclusion, whereas when we use the term untestable question, that means based on untestable question we cannot set up any controlled experiment and collect objective data. So, to collect objective data we need to set up testable questions, and based on the conclusion of testable questions we can draw conclusion of untestable questions. Both are important, and in this way we can manage them. Now, let us move to the second stage, that is variables identification. Let us reconsider research question 3. We have considered two values for the interface variable, our design and the MS Word. Now, we wish to observe the text entry speed for each, our design and MS Word. So, how we arrived at these interfaces? We assigned some values to the variable, we controlled its value. So, the variable here is interface. Interface is a variable where we assign the values, our interface vis-a-vis MS Word interface. So, two values we assigned, we controlled its values. Such variables which are controlled are known as independent variables. Sometimes, or in fact many a times, we use the term factors to denote these variables. So, we can use the term either independent variable or factors, and the values assigned to those factors we can call labels. So, the values assigned to variables are also known as labels of the variable, independent variable or factor. In our example, factor is the interface, and labels, there are two labels, one is our design and other one is MS Word. Now, the factors combined with their labels give us the test conditions for the experiment. So, based on these factors and labels we can decide or design our experiment. For example, observe text entry speed for a given text with our design and also with the MS Word. So, we can have two such test conditions for the factors and labels in our example, because there are two levels. So, for each level we can set up that experiment, observe text entry speed, first for our system and secondly for the existing system, that is MS Word. Now, in RQ3 there is also another variable, the text entry rate TR, based on which we are drawing a conclusion whether it is faster or not. Now, depends on the interface, that value of the variable depends on the interface, more specifically the levels of the interface. So, therefore, it is called the dependent variable. So, it depends on the interface. So, we have independent variable or factor having labels, and depending on the labels we get some values to the dependent variable. So, in our case dependent variable is the text entry rate. So, that is the second stage. So, just to recollect, we are talking of empirical study. So, in summary what we can say is that we are talking of empirical evaluation, which is we can term as empirical study, empirical research or usability research. The term empirical means observation in the real world of the real users, and this is done at the end when the system is fully implemented to get some idea of the overall usability of the system. There are 4 stages. So, we started talking about those stages. First stage is identification of research questions. We saw that identification of research question is not easy. So, essentially we need answers for broader generalizable questions which are untestable, for which conducting experiment and collecting objective data for definitive conclusion is not possible. However, we can overcome these by framing multiple testable research questions, for each of which we can collect objective data, come to definite conclusion, and then we can combine these conclusions for all the testable questions to come to a conclusion about the untestable questions. That is the research question framing. Second thing is variables. So, to design experiment, we need to identify the variables in the testable questions. Two types of variables are of importance here. There are other variables also. I will provide reference material from where you can get more details on these concepts. But the two most important variable types are dependent variables and independent variables. We have independent variables or factors which can take up levels or values, and then we have dependent variable which depends on the factors and levels. So, these are the first two stages of the empirical research or empirical study process. Two more stages remain, which we will discuss in the next part of the lecture. So, I hope you could follow the topics, you could understand the concepts. Looking forward to meet you in the next part of the lecture. Till then, thank you, goodbye and happy learning.